Morning light crept through tall windows into a small apartment on the left bank of Paris. The room smelled of rosin and old wood. In the corner, a dark cello case lay open like a sleeping animal. The boy, not yet 4 years old, stood on his toes to peer inside. His fingers barely reached the strings, but he knew that something important lived inside that hollow wooden shape. His father, a violinist and composer, moved quietly in the dim kitchen, preparing tea. There was no rush in this household, only a patient rhythm of notes and silence. On the street below, a baker arranged baguettes in the window, and the city stirred gently like an orchestra tuning its instruments. The Seine glittered with the first yellow light of day, and every stone along the river seemed to hold a quiet memory of music. His name was Yo-Yo Ma. He was born in 1955 to Chinese parents who had settled in Paris after leaving war-torn China. Their home was filled with the sound of string instruments and the scent of ink and paper. His father, Hyot Ma, was a gentle man who believed that children should learn music not as a duty but as a language. Even before Yo-Yo could write his own name, he could hum a Bach melody his sister played on the piano. The father would sit on a cushioned chair, drawing musical notes on a chalkboard, teaching the boy to recognize each voice of the orchestra, the bird-like flute, the warm cello, the dignified bass. The child listened with eyes wide, his small feet dangling high above the parquet floor. When Yo-Yo was 3, his father began teaching him the violin. But the boy was drawn instead to the large, deeper-voiced instrument that stood in the corner of the conservatory, the double bass. It was far too large for him, so a compromise was found, a child-sized cello, an instrument that could sing both low and high, that sat between the knees like a trusted companion. The first time he drew the bow across the strings, the sound vibrated in his chest. It was a warm hum, like a cat purring on a lap. He decided then and there that this was the voice he wanted to have. His father, seeing the spark, began to give him lessons every day, but always for very short periods, never tiring the child, always ending before the patience ran out. That was the secret, a tiny dose of joy, never a chore. In the afternoons, after practicing a few simple scales, Yo-Yo would walk with his mother along the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter. The stone buildings were draped in ivy that rustled like silk. Mothers called to their children from balconies, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from every corner. He held his mother's hand and watched the shadows of plane trees dance on the pavement. Sometimes they would stop at a small park where an old carousel turned under a painted canopy, its music box chiming the same waltz over and over. The boy would sit on a bench, listening, not writing, just absorbing the circular lullaby. Even then, he understood that music was not something you only played, it was something you lived inside, like the air around you. The family's apartment was modest, but filled with portraits of ancestors and shelves of books in Chinese. His mother, Marina Liu, had been a singer in Hong Kong, and her voice still carried the sweetness of the lullabies she sang to him at night. The candles on the dinner table flickered as the family ate quietly, talking about the new phrase of music the boy had learned that day. They used chopsticks that tapped softly against porcelain bowls, a quiet percussion. Through the window, the Eiffel Tower would sometimes flash its lights, a faraway beacon. In the quiet of the evening, the boy would sit cross-legged on the rug, holding a tiny bow, drawing long notes from his half-sized cello, the sound bleeding into the Parisian twilight like ink in water. Summer came, and the family traveled to Switzerland to attend an international music gathering. There, Yo-Yo saw mountains for the first time, jagged peaks with snow caps that caught the morning light, making them look like meringues. He played his little cello in a large stone hall where the sound echoed for several seconds after the bow stopped. He felt something new, the presence of an audience, the hush of strangers who were now listening. The applause was gentle, like rain on a rooftop. Pablo Casals, the great Catalan cellist who had made the cello sing across the century, was in attendance, a very old man with kind eyes. The boy did not fully understand the legend in the room, but he felt the weight of a quiet approval, a soft nod, the passing of a torch without any words spoken. Back in Paris, the days grew shorter. Autumn leaves fell into the Seine and turned it into a ribbon of gold and rust. Yo-O's father decided that it was time for the family to move to a new country, a place where the children could have more freedom, more space. The boy packed his cello in its canvas case, wrapped it in his own coat as if it were a younger sibling. The family boarded an ocean liner at Le Havre. Standing on the deck, Yo-O watched the French coastline shrink into a thin line of gray. Seagulls cried overhead. The ship's horn blew a deep note, a low C-sharp that resonated in his bones. He looked forward, toward an unknown world, holding the railing with one hand and his mother's sleeve with the other, his heart already composing a new melody for the life ahead. Night fell on the Atlantic. The ship cut through calm waters under a canopy of stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. In the small cabin, the boy opened his cello case and, for just a moment, put his ear against the wood. It was silent now, but he could still feel the hum of all the music it would one day make. The ship rocked slowly, a great lullaby of the deep. He fell asleep with the taste of salt in the air and the distant piano music from the ballroom drifting through the walls. In his dream, he was back in the Paris apartment, a candle burning low, his father smiling, his fingers on the strings, and a long, peaceful note stretching into the dawn. The ship arrived in New York Harbor on a hazy morning. The skyline rose out of the mist like a cluster of pale crystals, unfamiliar and immense. Yo-Yo Ma stood at the railing with his sister, looking at the Statue of Liberty, which seemed to be holding not a torch but a quiet promise. When they docked, the sounds of the city washed over them, taxi horns, distant sirens, thousands of footsteps on pavement, a syncopated rhythm that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The family carried their few suitcases and the precious cello into a yellow cab that smelled of leather and old coffee. They rode through canyons of brick and steel, and Yo-O pressed his face against the window, watching the fire escapes zigzag up the sides of buildings like musical staves. They settled into a modest apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, not far from the great cathedral of music they would soon call their second home. The apartment was small, but filled with the same familiar objects: the chalkboard, the music scores, the pot of tea always warm on the stove. The window looked out onto a courtyard where a single sycamore tree stretched its branches toward the sky. At night, the city never truly slept, and the boy would lie in bed listening to the distant rumble of the subway, a low, vibrating cello note that ran beneath the streets. In the morning, he would practice scales while watching the neighbors across the air shaft hang their laundry out to dry, the white sheets billowing like silent flags of an everyday opera. His father enrolled him in the Juilliard School's preparatory division. The building was a grand limestone structure filled with 100 practice rooms, each one humming with its own private world of sound. Yo-O would walk down the long corridors, past doors that leaked fragments of piano arpeggios, flute trills, and the occasional operatic soprano. He found a favorite room on an upper floor with a window that overlooked a quiet side street. There, for an hour each afternoon, he would unpack his cello and let the music fill the small space. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the light came in at a gentle angle, casting a golden rectangle on the wooden floor. His teacher at Juilliard, a wise old cellist named Leonard Rose, taught him that every note was a story, that the bow was a painter's brush, and that silence between notes was as important as the sound. New York became a landscape of wonders. On weekends, the family would walk through Central Park, a vast green rectangle that felt like a country meadow transported into the heart of the city. They passed under stone arches, crossed the Bow Bridge, and paused to watch the rowboats glide across the lake. The trees here were different from Paris, elms and oaks that changed color with spectacular showmanship in the autumn, first yellow, then orange, then a deep red that seemed to hum with warmth. The boy collected fallen leaves and pressed them between the pages of his sheet music so that every time he opened his Bach suites, a small piece of autumn would crumble onto the music stand. In the distance, the towers of the San Remo apartments rose like sentinels, their spires catching the last light of the afternoon. During the long summer evenings, the neighborhood came alive with a softer rhythm. Ice cream trucks played tinkling melodies, and fire hydrants were opened to let children dance in the cool spray. Yo-O would sit on the brownstone stoop with his sister, watching the light change from gold to purple. They would sometimes hear a neighbor practicing piano through an open window, the notes drifting down like fireflies. In those moments, he learned an essential truth about his new city. Music was everywhere here, not just in concert halls, but in the jingle of a cart, the call of a street vendor, the honk of a distant barge on the Hudson River. The city itself was a sprawling, unorganized symphony, and he began to understand that his cello was simply one more voice in a very large choir. The boy's reputation grew quietly. At the age of 7, he performed for President John F. Kennedy at a gala, a moment captured in a famous photograph. But for Yo-Oh, that evening was less about fame and more about the sensation of playing in a large, beautiful room, where the chandeliers sparkled like frozen fountains and the audience sat in a respectful hush. He wore a small suit that his mother had sewn, and he focused on his strings, not on the famous faces. The applause that followed was warm, but what he remembered most was the ride home afterward, sitting in the backseat of a car, watching the lights of Washington, D.C. slide past, his cello case resting across his lap like a sleeping pet. The world outside the window was dark and calm, and he felt a deep peace, knowing he had done his best. As the years passed, the boy became a young man, but the quiet habits of his childhood never left him. He still preferred morning practice to late-night parties. He still carried his cello on his back like a turtle carries its shell, finding comfort in its weight. He moved through the streets of New York with a calm demeanor, his mind always half-filled with the next phrase of a Beethoven sonata or a Dvorak concerto. In the university library at Columbia, where he later studied, he would sit near a high window and read philosophy books, seeing music in the patterns of thought. The seasons in New York continued their gentle cycle, and, through it all, the cello remained his constant companion, a wooden voice that had traveled with him across an ocean and would soon take him around the globe. There is a particular room in the memory of every musician where the first encounter with great music lives like a perpetual dawn. For Yo-Yo Ma, that room was a sunlit studio in the countryside, far from the noise of the city. He was a teenager when he first truly inhabited the 6 cello suites of Johann Sebastian Bach. The music had been with him since childhood, as it is for all cellists, but there came a day when the notes stopped being exercises and became a conversation. He placed the worn sheet music on a wooden stand and began to play the prelude of the first suite. The opening G major chord rose into the air like a bird testing its wings. In that moment, he felt as though he were not alone in the room. Bach himself seemed to be leaning against the doorframe, listening with a quiet smile. Bach's suites are a kind of prayer without words, a series of dances and meditations that trace the shape of the human spirit. Yo-Oh would practice them in an old stone chapel that had been converted into a recording space. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, painting patches of ruby and sapphire on the flagstone floor. The air was cool and still, and each note he produced lingered for a long moment, resonating in the ancient stone. He would spend hours on a single measure, searching for the exact weight of the bow, the precise speed of the vibrato that would make the note sing with both joy and sorrow. To him, the suites were a landscape, the allemande was a wandering path through a quiet forest, the courant a playful stream, the saraband a still, deep lake under a moonless sky. The young cellist came to understand that Bach's music held a special kind of time. It was not the hurried time of clocks and deadlines, but a slower, deeper time that felt almost like breathing. When he played the slow saraband from the fifth suite, the world outside the chapel dissolved. He imagined himself in a candlelit room, centuries earlier, in the German town of Cothen, where Bach had composed these pieces for a court musician. In that room, a single candle burned on a table, its flame perfectly still. There were no microphones, no audiences, just one human being drawing music out of the silence. Yo-Oh tried to find that same stillness. He closed his eyes and let the bow move like a slow pendulum, each note a tiny act of reverence. In 1983, he recorded the suites for the first time, in a studio nestled in the Berkshire Hills. The building was a converted barn with wide pine floorboards that had seen a century of seasons. Outside, the autumn leaves were at their peak, a sea of crimson and gold that stretched to the horizon. Through the studio's large windows, he could see a red-tailed hawk circling slowly in the thermal updrafts, its wings motionless. Between takes, Yoa would step outside and breathe the crisp air. He would walk to a small pond nearby, where the surface was so still it mirrored the entire sky. He thought about how Bach's music was like that pond, a calm surface that reflected the full depth of the world. The recording sessions were not rushed. They flowed like the gentle hills that surrounded them, each phrase taking the time it needed. Years later, Yoa would revisit the suites, recording them again and again, but that first time in the Berkshires held a special magic. It was a moment of pure youth encountering timelessness. In the evenings, after the recording equipment was turned off, he would sit on the porch of the farmhouse and watch the sun set behind the hills. The sky turned from orange to lavender to a deep indigo pricked with the first stars. He would hold his cello, not playing, just feeling the wood cool in the evening air. Nearby, an owl called softly from a pine tree, a two-note song that sounded like a question without an answer. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimney. It was in these quiet, undemanding moments that the deepest understanding of the suites settled into his bones. The suites were not about performance, but about presence, the simple act of being fully in one place and one note at a time. The suites would accompany him throughout his life, becoming a kind of spiritual diary. He would play them in grand concert halls in Tokyo, London, and Vienna, but he always returned to the memory of that country chapel and that barn in the Berkshires. Even in the largest venues, he could summon the stillness. He learned to listen to the silence before the first note, a silence that was not empty but full of possibility. The audience would lean forward in the velvet seats, and for a single, suspended moment, everyone in the hall would be breathing together. Then the bow would move, and the great river of Bach's melody would begin to flow once more, carrying forward all the peace of those country mornings, all the patience of the hawk circling overhead, all the gentle light of a candle that had never been extinguished.